well, this just isn't going to work. So now Rosalie has a hard job. It was supposed to be easy for her. But I need you to move on to the next one. Per Wikipedia, quote, Mother's Day is a modern celebration honoring one's own mother, as well as motherhood, maternal bonds, and the influence of mothers in society, end quote. So that's kind of what Mother's Day is supposed to be. It's not just for your mother. It's not just if you're a mother. We're celebrating, besides your own mother, the idea of motherhood and that institution. And think about the influence of mothers in society. I want to begin just by reminding you, next one, motherhood was God's idea. As creator, God had some freedom. If you're going to build a house, you get to decide what it's going to look like and the floor plan and how it's going to, and all those things. Well, God, when he was creating everything, he created everything the way he wanted to. And he could have designed some type of a robot factory, that's where babies come from and all this, But he had the idea of using parents to raise children. And having mothers give birth and then have that motherhood. That was his idea. He didn't have to do it that way, but he did. Maybe we could have been like apples on a tree. But no, God chose mothers to give birth. As creator, he could have created us any other way. And then, of course, I want to remind you of the fifth commandment. In the 10 Commandments, honor your father and mother. And I want to point out a couple of things. There's always these things about courtrooms posting the 10 Commandments. And I will sometimes cynically point out that only about 2 to 2.5 of the commandments are actually in American law. We don't have a law that says you have to honor your father and mother. That's a 10 Commandment. It's not part of our legal code. But here's the funny thing. In the society in which these commandments were given and developed was very patriarchal. And we don't like to think about it, but it was very discriminatory. And it was all about the men. And the men having the rights and the authority and all of that. And that's, we talk about Father Abraham and the patriarchs and all of that. In our culture, we don't talk much about the matriarchs. But for Abraham, there was a Sarah, and for Isaac, there was a Rebecca, and so on and so forth. We had all these women. And it would have been really radical at the time the 10 Commandments were given by God to the people to include women. For this to be honor your mother would have been considered a radical idea. That wasn't part of the other cultures in the area. That was a God thing. And so because of that command to honor your father and mother, along with much of the country today, and in keeping with that radical fifth commandment, we are happy to be honoring mothers today, even in church. And I'll just briefly point out that's not true of every holiday. On the calendar we have all of these religious holidays, and we have the secular holidays, and most of the time we might give a tip of the hat to the secular holidays, but we really don't focus on them and make them a part of our services in a significant kind of way, other than just mention, Happy Memorial Day or whatever it might be. But Mother's Day, this is biblical that we honor mothers. That's part of their 10 Commandments. It doesn't get much more basic than that. And so, along with much of the country today, we're going to kind of talk Mother's Day related. Now, even when I say Mother's Day related, there are so many possibilities. So many different things you can do as a preacher on Mother's Day. And I've been doing this for a few years now. I think about 5. Maybe more than that. It's hard to believe with my age, but But sometimes I'll pick just a random biblical mother and tell her story and talk about what we learned from that and that kind of thing. And sometimes I kind of preach at mothers. This is how you ought to be. And sometimes I preach about how great mothers are. And there's just all of these options that you can preach about on Mother's Day. And today, I want to return to kind of what is my favorite concept for Mother's Day. And it comes from the idea that, mimicry has been said to be the highest form of flattery. And the Apostle Paul suggests that we mimic mothers as we seek to carry out our mission. And given the importance of our mission, that's a pretty big compliment. We are supposed to go out into all the world and spread the gospel and bring people into the kingdom and introduce them to Jesus and all that. And Paul, in one of his writings, basically said to do it like a mom. Pretty big compliment. So let's go to the scripture, 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 to 6. To start with, we're going to look at more than that. 1 Thessalonians 2, page 956 if you're using one of our worship Bibles. All right. 1 Thessalonians 2, 1 to 6. You know, brothers and sisters, that our first visit to you was not without results. We had previously suffered and been treated outrageously in Philippi, as you know, but with the help of our God, we dared to tell you his gospel in the face of strong opposition. For the appeal we make does not spring from error or impure motives, nor are we trying to trick you. On the contrary, we speak as those approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel. We are not trying to please other people, but God who tests our hearts. You know, we never used flattery, nor did we put on a mask to cover up greed. God is our witness. We were not looking for praise from people, not from you or anyone else, even though as apostles of Christ, we could have asserted our authority. And so Paul begins by describing not his approach. He talks about the things that he didn't do. And I want to go through that list just very briefly of his not approach. He didn't use trickery. I studied a little bit of marketing in school, and we talked a little bit about advertising and sales. And one of the things that was against the law that companies had finally begun to get in trouble for, it used to be more common, and that was the old bait and switch. You advertise a super deal on this new refrigerator, and when you do your ordering and everything, you only order 2 of them. So you have 2 of those in stock, and they sell out the first day. And then for the rest of the week or 2 that the sale's on, they come in and you say, oh, we don't have that model anymore. Let me talk to you about this other model that's more expensive and we make a bigger profit on, and so on and so forth. And that was called bait and switch. You kind of get them in on one thing and then there's all kinds of other stuff. Paul didn't do that. Now, I've seen Christians who have. They will push Christianity only on the basis of going to heaven someday. That's the only thing they want to say about it. They don't talk about, giving up sin, and they don't want to talk about, living a life for Jesus and loving others and even loving your enemies, and that's all part of it. They just want to focus on you get to go to heaven someday. That's almost bait and switch, if that's all you build it on. But Paul didn't do that. He didn't use trickery. He let them know what was on the line and what it meant and what it involved, and so they did that. He didn't use flattery. Again, I remember back, my mother raising me, and there were those days when, we weren't always the best kids and didn't always have the best motives. And then there would be those days you'd come in, hi, Mom. you look good today. And after a little bit of that, boy, that was a great dinner. And after a little bit of that buttering up, then would come the, oh, by the way, can I? And then the request would come. We learned that, that flattery would help. But Paul didn't use flattery. He didn't try to butter them up and trick them that way either. Nor was he greedy. And again, there were those in Paul's day who saw the gospel as a good money-making venture. Now, I'll be honest, in our world today, unless you're a mega-church pastor, this isn't that great of a money-making venture either. And so, even though pastors are kind of universally accused of being money-grubbing, I'll just be honest and say I could have made more money elsewhere. When I felt God called me to ministry, I was a computer science major, and it was a great time to be a computer science major. And I had friends being flown around the country for interviews and stepping into great jobs with great salaries. And in the midst of that, I sat down with Rob one day and I said, I've got some news. We weren't married yet, but we were pretty serious. I think God is calling me into ministry. And so I'm going to give up computer sciences and go in that direction. And that's going to mean something financially and all of that as well. So Paul was that way. He was not greedy. He wasn't doing it for the money. He wasn't seeking praise. That was another thing. Some of those, they were more concerned about the reputation and the status of being those kind of people. Nor was he authoritative or assertive. And I grew up in a time when it was popular, the people would, at least in conversation, the preachers who were the most domineering and pounded the pulpit and acted stern, and this is, and I took a class during my seminary years. It was my favorite class on preaching that was called, or the textbook we used was called As One Without Authority. And it was based on the idea that it said that about Jesus. He taught as one without authority, because that's how the rabbis taught. They taught with authority. And what they say you better listen to. And they would use other rabbis to, Rabbi so-and-so said this, and you better listen, And Jesus took a different approach. And we were told we ought to be taking a different approach. That hard-nosed, pound the pulpit, and, it's not the approach we were taught to take. And so Paul was that way. He taught without authority. I don't know if I bumped something or if you bumped something, but we lost our screen. Fortunately for you, I still have my notes. We're going to move on to the next couple of verses, or the next verse and a half or whatever. It's actually the second part of verse 7 to the first part of verse 8. Paul says this: just as a nursing mother cares for her children, so we cared for you. Think about that. When Paul's talking about his ministry amongst the Thessalonians, instead of trickery and flattery and greed and all of those things that we just talked about, his approach was like motherhood. That was the way he approached ministry. He said, like mother, just as a nursing mother cares for her children, so we cared for you. The motherhood approach. Two main points, I think, that we can draw from. As a mother cares for her children, one of the ways that she cares for her children is gently or tenderly. Does that make sense to you? Have you observed mothers caring for their children? If you've been a mother, have you cared, how's that work? Gently and tenderly. Now, there were days when I needed to be disciplined, and my mother disciplined me. But even then, her approach was gentle. In fact, we got ourselves in trouble one time because Mom decided we needed to be spanked. And I was too stupid to make the most of the opportunity, and taunted my mom for the lack of emphasis in her spankings.
Oh, yes.
That didn't even hurt. Not too smart. So she learned other ways. She never did spank very hard. Never did, but you start losing freedoms and opportunities and being sent to your room and toys taken away. And there are other ways to discipline besides being hit. But that was my mom's way. That gentleness or tenderness in caring for her children. And then the other way, of course, was thoroughly. They cared gently and tenderly. They also cared for us thoroughly. Everything involved. She covered all the bases. I said, she made sure we were in church. She also made sure we were doing our homework. She also made sure that, if the school needed a volunteer mom, she was one of the moms to volunteer. And she was just thorough. And she wanted to know about what we were eating and all the way across the board. So Paul's really saying that when he cared about the Thessalonians, I think he was gentle. He was also thorough. Biblical scholar R.L. Thomas says this: the figure of motherhood implies a special effort to protect and to provide for every need, even to the extent of sacrifice. I can also remember some of the things that, my family, we weren't, we weren't going hungry, but we didn't have a lot of extra money. And I can still remember a lot of things that at the time, I didn't really think too much about it, but looking back, like when I got a mini bike one year, I know that involved some sacrifice on some things that my mom would like to have had. And didn't get because they used that money to buy me a mini bike instead, and so on and so forth. But Paul says that about his approach to ministry with the Thessalonians. But let's move on to the next part of verse 8. Because we loved you so much, we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well. So another aspect of the motherhood approach is because we loved you so much. And I've emphasized on the screen that word love. Here's the thing. As you go out to carry out your mission, as you go out to win the lost, guess what your attitude toward the lost needs to be? Any guesses? Love. Now, unfortunately, I think we live in a world where we're so accustomed to the dichotomy, and the sinners are the enemy. We need to hammer down the sinners. We're at war with the sinners, and that whole mindset, we want to beat sinners through legislation. And so on and so forth, and we look at them as the bad guys, and of course, they're sinners, so they're kind of bad guys in that regard. But when Jesus looked at them, when Jesus looked at that same group, he saw them like sheep without a shepherd, and took compassion on them. And that's how we need to think about the people with whom we disagree about morality. Instead of seeing them as the enemy, we need to see them as sheep without shepherds, and we need to love them, and that's the approach we need to take. Just a personal story. My sister was a teenage runaway, a very young teenage runaway, and she ran away with a boy, and they ran off, and she got pregnant, and she was only 13. And when things finally evolved and a couple of months went by and they were going to return home, pretty much everybody that had advice from my mom and dad, their advice was, get him arrested, put the hammer down, teach her a lesson, whatever. And it wasn't a popular decision, but my mom and my dad, they said, no, we're going to treat him more like the prodigal son. She'll come home, we're going to love her, we're going to try to love him. Which they did, and they accepted him as, they helped them to get married, helped them to establish themselves as a family, and took him under wing, and so on and so forth. In spite of that, divorce ensued, as one would probably have expected, but not for anything mom and dad did, the opposite. So that was that motherhood approach. We need to look at sinners like lost people and love them. More about the motherhood approach. He says he was delighted to share not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well. We had a professor who used to use the term in a bad way, in a negative way, hit and run evangelism. And he talked about how a lot of Christians, that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to find a sinner and yell at him about the gospel and then move on. They want to just, hit and run, because you don't want to, hang out with sinners too much. But Paul, he's talking about the idea of building relationships. Those are necessary. And you know what that requires? Giving time. You can't build relationships without investing some time. And I've known some of these sinners or people who don't want to give time to sinners, and giving energy. Sometimes you got to put yourself out. You got to do something. I don't feel like going out tonight, but I'm going to because so and so invited me, and whatever. In fact, there's a kind of a buzzword. I hesitate to use that term, but a popular term right now in evangelism that is called incarnational. They talk about living incarnational, and it comes from the idea that Jesus was the Son of God in heaven, and he became one of us so that he could hang out with us and be one of us, eventually to be killed by us. But we refer to him becoming human as the incarnation. Being incarnational is putting yourself into the lives of others, being one of them, being one with them. That doesn't mean to sin with them, but it does mean to hang out with sinners. And I've shared with you before, I know, when I was a teenager, everything was about church. If you wanted to play ball, you started a church ball league, because if you're going to play ball, you need to play with other Christians. And then as I became a seminary graduate and would begin, it's like, we ought to just form a team and join the city league, because that's going to put us in touch with sinners, and that's the ones we need to be friends with and win over, and so on and so forth. And so didn't always work out. I spent 2 or 3 years in a church golf league where we went out and golfed and made friends with other church people, and it's like, we should have been doing that with sinners. We should have just, of course, we'd probably been beaten worse if we joined a real golf league. But as a church golf league, I was competitive, almost. The idea of becoming incarnational. So, I say all that to say this. As we honor mothers today for the way they care for their children, let's remember that there's a whole lost world out there that needs mothering. And we, the church, are just the people to do it. It's as simple as that. We need to go out in the world and mother sinners. That's the best way we're going to win them. That's the best way we're going to get them into the kingdom. And that is our mission. And like Paul, we should do it like a mother. Let's pray.